Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. This video uses AI narration to present our original book analysis. Today we're diving deep into The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis. It's about all the ways the government works to keep us safe. From risks, all kinds of risks, and what happens when those efforts are just ignored, especially when a new administration comes in. Have you ever thought about what could go wrong if the people in charge aren't really paying attention? Well, that's what Lewis calls the fifth risk, and he uses these really compelling stories to show us what's at stake.
It is fascinating how he highlights all those unsung heroes,
Yeah.
the people working tirelessly behind the scenes to protect us from threats, things that we might not even realize are threats.
Exactly. You wouldn't think a presidential transition would be that big of a deal. But Lewis makes it so clear that a smooth handover of power is crucial. It's crucial to avoid chaos and risk. He contrasts the Trump administration's transition with Max Steer's efforts to improve the process through his Partnership for Public Service.
Steer really understood how fragile that system can be, where so much knowledge and experience is concentrated in individuals rather than institutional memory. The Trump administration just completely disregarded this, their whole approach to the Department of Energy. The DOE, remember that anecdote about them demanding a list of all the employees involved in climate change initiatives?
Oh, yeah, that was chilling.
Yeah.
It felt like a deliberate attempt to just intimidate people.
Yeah.
And silence experts.
Yeah.
But thankfully then, Secretary Ernest Moniz refused. He refused to provide the list, protecting his staff.
Right.
But it really shows you how little they cared about the DOE's work.
Yeah.
It's almost like they didn't even want to know what they didn't know, which is a perfect example of the fifth risk.
Exactly. They were not interested in understanding those complex challenges that the DOE was tackling, maintaining the nuclear arsenal, cleaning up nuclear waste, shaping America's energy policy.
And speaking of which, that story about John McWilliams.
Yeah.
The Wall Street guy.
Yeah.
Who ends up at the DOE. Talk about a culture shock.
Oh, absolutely. He was totally lost at first, completely overwhelmed by how complex the DOE was, so many responsibilities, so much bureaucracy. He even compared trying to figure out their organizational chart to deciphering a foreign language.
I can imagine. But it's clear he was committed to public service.
Mm-hmm.
But even he was frustrated by the administration's lack of interest in learning about all the crucial work the DOE was doing. The book uses the Hanford site as a powerful example. It's a former plutonium production facility of the long-term risks involved in this kind of work.
Hanford is just this stark reminder of what happens when you neglect project management, especially when you're dealing with something as dangerous as nuclear waste. I mean, think about it. This site played a crucial role in the Manhattan Project during World War II, producing plutonium for the atomic bomb. But that production left behind so much radioactive waste, that poses all these environmental and health risks.
To this day, it's a problem that's going to take generations to fully address. And Lewis hints that the full extent of the risks were maybe downplayed or even hidden during the Cold War. That's what makes the fifth risk so dangerous. It can be overlooked when the consequences aren't immediately apparent.
Yeah. The Hanford cleanup, it's a multi-generational project, requires meticulous planning and execution. McWilliams saw firsthand how neglecting these details, even small ones, can have these disastrous consequences.
And then on the flip side, Lewis introduces us to ARPA. It's an agency within the DOE, and it's focused on fostering energy innovation. Arun Majumdar, who headed that initiative, described the DOE's feng shui as really bad, suggesting its potential for groundbreaking innovation was being stifled by bureaucracy and just a lack of vision.
Majumdar's observation is so important about fostering a culture of innovation and encouraging risk-taking within these government agencies. Sadly, it seemed like the new administration was more interested in dismantling existing programs than exploring new possibilities.
And this disregard for expertise and innovation, it wasn't limited to just the DOE. It extended to other crucial agencies, like the USDA, the Department of Agriculture. You wouldn't think the USDA would be controversial. But Lewis shows us how political agendas can completely undermine even the most vital programs. He introduces us to Ali Zadia, a young official tasked with overseeing the USDA's budget. He quickly realizes how much of an impact the department has on everyday American lives.
And Zaidi was particularly concerned about their nutrition programs, the ones that are responsible for feeding millions of Americans through initiatives like school lunches and food assistance for low-income families. And that's where Kevin Concannon comes in, the head of Food, Nutrition, and Consumer Services. He managed a crazy amount of money.
Yeah, nearly $1 trillion, dedicated to keeping people fed. And Concannon himself had a personal connection to government assistance. His family relied on it when his brother was struggling with schizophrenia. And he dedicated his life to making sure people in need received the help they deserved. But what's shocking is that he faced so much pushback from certain states, almost like they didn't want their citizens to get help.
Exactly. Lewis gives some just jaw-dropping examples, like that proposal for an orange food stamp card, clearly intended to stigmatize people. There were even attempts to schedule food distribution on Election Day, potentially preventing people from voting.
It's like they were more concerned with politics than actually helping people. And then there's the whole argument that food assistance promotes laziness.
Right.
Which Kincannon debunks completely. The average benefit is so small, it barely covers a single meal, and most of the recipients are children, the elderly, or people with disabilities.
And those who are able-bodied, they're required to work or attend job training to even receive benefits.
It's a far cry from just lounging around, living off the government. These are vital programs that help millions of Americans put food on the table. And they were constantly under threat. And then you have Sonny Perdue, the Trump administration's pick to lead the USDA. He was known for rolling back school lunch nutrition standards, which could have devastating consequences for children's health.
It's a perfect example of what can happen when you appoint someone with no understanding and no interest in the agency's work. It can have these huge negative impacts.
It's like putting a fox in charge of the henhouse.
And speaking of people who really understood the work, Lewis introduces us to Lillian Salerno. She ran the USDA's enormous bank, the one servicing rural America.
Yeah, Salerno had such a unique perspective. She started out as a small business owner before going into government. So she had this practical, fiscally responsible approach to her role. She knew that it was taxpayer money, and it had to be managed carefully.
But she wasn't afraid to shake things up either. She was pretty vocal about the inefficiencies she saw, even joked about how few employees even knew how to use a spreadsheet. Right. She found a workforce that was under-resourced, technologically behind, and just lacking the tools to serve rural communities effectively.
And her biggest fear was that the Trump administration, with its ties to Wall Street, might exploit these programs for their own gain instead of helping the people who needed it most.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought to think about how that power can be abused when people prioritize personal gain over public service. But on a more positive note, let's talk about DJ Patil, Obama's chief data scientist.
Okay, Vijay Patil, the data scientist pioneer. His story is amazing. Went from struggling to find a job in Silicon Valley to being sought out by the president.
Yeah.
What was it about him that caught the Obama administration's attention?
It was his vision for how data could be used to improve how the government works, to address all these societal problems. He'd worked on everything, from predicting weather patterns to identifying terrorist networks. And he saw the potential for applying those same principles to a whole range of challenges.
But the Trump administration wasn't interested.
Unfortunately not. They seem to miss the boat on data-driven decision-making.
It's a shame, because he had some really innovative ideas, like using data to investigate the rise in traffic fatalities and predict disease outbreaks.
Right.
So instead of reacting to crises, data could help us get ahead of them.
Exactly. It could be a powerful tool for proactive problem-solving. But sadly, that potential was ignored. Speaking of visionary leaders, though, let's talk about Kathy Sullivan, the former astronaut who headed NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Okay, Kathy Sullivan, a true trailblazer. First American woman to walk in space, then heads NOAA. That's quite a career.
Yeah.
What were some of the challenges she faced?
Well, going from the celebratory, high-profile world of NASA to the less recognized work of NOAA was a big shift. But her experience navigating male-dominated fields like space exploration definitely prepared her for leading a large government agency.
But she also had to deal with the increasing politicization of weather forecasting.
Right. While the National Weather Service, which is part of NOAA, focuses on accuracy and public safety, these private companies like AccuWeather were more concerned with profits. They were hyping up forecasts to attract customers.
And there was that disturbing incident where AccuWeather withheld tornado warnings from people who weren't paying.
Yeah, during that severe storm in Moore, Oklahoma, and at the same time, they were broadcasting videos of hippos swimming on their network channel while people were in danger.
It's a chilling example of how profit motives can be put above public safety.
It really is.
It makes you think about who you can trust to give you reliable information, especially during a crisis. But Lewis doesn't just focus on the big picture. He introduces us to Kim Klockow, a meteorologist who returned to Oklahoma after working with Sullivan at NOAA.
Clackout was really inspired by Sullivan's advice about making small bets to create change. She decided to focus on improving tornado forecasting and warning systems at a local level. She saw firsthand the impact these storms could have.
She was actually out there chasing tornadoes, trying to gather data to improve forecasting models.
She was, but it wasn't about thrill-seeking. She was trying to understand these storms better so she could help improve those forecasting models and warning systems to ultimately save lives.
So it's not just about predicting the weather. It's about communicating that information effectively to the people who need it most.
Exactly. Bridging that gap between science and the public, it's crucial. She worked closely with local emergency managers like Lonnie Risenhoover in Elk City, Oklahoma, to make sure people were getting the information they needed to stay safe.
Didn't they have a story about a particular tornado in Elk City where improved forecasting actually saved lives?
They did. There was this new tornado model. It was being tested by researchers, and it kept predicting a tornado in Elk City, even when they changed the variables. It was like seeing the future.
So they knew it was coming before it even formed.
That's the idea. And because of that early warning, the local emergency manager was able to issue a tornado warning earlier than usual, giving people more time to cover.
Wow, that's incredible. It sounds like we're on the verge of a major breakthrough.
We are.
In tornado prediction.
But even with those advancements, there's always a risk that people won't heed the warnings or that they won't even have access to the information in the first place.
That's a great point. It's not enough to just have the knowledge. It has to reach the people who need it, and they have to be willing to act on it. It highlights the human element of risk mitigation and how important it is to have people like Clackout and Risenhoover working together.
Absolutely. You need the expertise and the trust of the community to effectively manage these risks.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to how interconnected all of these issues are and how neglecting any part of the system can have these far-reaching consequences.
It really has.
And I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. The fifth risk goes so much deeper into all these issues, and it explores even more examples of what can go wrong when we don't pay attention to the work being done to keep us safe.
It really is a must-read for anyone who wants to understand all those hidden dangers facing our society and the importance of being an informed and engaged citizen.
Well said. But we're not done yet. We have 2 more parts to this deep dive. We'll be back soon to explore more insights from the fifth risk.
One of the things that struck me was how crucial data is to understanding and mitigating all these risks. Yeah. Lewis argues that the government holds this treasure trove of data that could be used to solve so many problems, but it's often overlooked or even suppressed.
Right. It's like we're drowning in data, but we don't know how to swim.
That's a great way to put it.
We have all this information, but are we using it effectively?
That's the million-dollar question, and Lewis gives this great example with David Friedberg and his company, the Climate Corporation. He basically revolutionized agriculture by harnessing the power of data.
Oh, yeah. The Climate Corporation. Remind me what they were all about.
So Friedberg started with this idea of selling weather insurance to businesses. But he quickly realized that the real opportunity was in agriculture. Farmers are always at the mercy of the weather, and traditional crop insurance didn't really cover those smaller losses from things like a late frost or a dry spell.
So he was trying to create a more precise way to assess weather risk for farmers.
Exactly. But to do it, he needed tons of data, historical weather patterns, soil types, crop yields, you name it.
And I'm guessing a lot of that data came from the government.
You got it. They've been collecting this kind of information forever.
Right.
So Friedberg was able to tap into all this publicly available data from agencies like the National Weather Service and the USDA. He combined it with his own data collection to create these really detailed risk models for individual farms.
So he was taking the guesswork out of farming.
In a way, yeah. He could tell a farmer the best time to plant, fertilize, even harvest, based on the specific conditions of their fields and the predicted weather.
Wow. It's like having a personal weather forecaster, an agricultural advisor, all in one day.
Pretty much. And what's fascinating is he started out selling insurance, but farmers were more interested in the data itself. They were logging into his system just to check on their fields, see how much moisture was in the soil, what the temperature was, all that.
So he was selling them knowledge, not just insurance policies.
Exactly. The Climate Corporation went from an insurance company to this data and analytics powerhouse, giving farmers the information they needed to make better decisions and improve their yields.
And of course, Monsanto eventually bought them.
Yeah, for over $1 billion.
Wow. So data can really be a game changer. But Lewis also cautions us about how access to data can also be a source of conflict. Remember that example with the National Weather Service and those private weather companies?
Right. There's a perfect example of how the battle over data can play out. The National Weather Service provides free, publicly available weather data, the kind that's essential for everyone. Farmers, airlines, emergency responders. But then you have these private companies, like AccuWeather. They want to monetize that same data by selling specialized forecasts and alerts.
And they often lobby against the government, making that data too easily accessible.
Right, because it would hurt their profits.
It really raises questions about how we balance public access to information with private enterprise. Who owns the data? Who benefits from it? These are issues that are just going to keep coming up.
Definitely. As we gather more and more data about every aspect of our lives.
It's a tricky balance.
Yeah.
But Lewis doesn't just focus on the potential of data. He also looks at some of those more traditional risks that the government has to manage, like nuclear proliferation, especially with North Korea and Iran.
Right. And that's where he really drives home the potential consequences. When we neglect these risks, what he calls the fifth risk, McWilliams from the DOE, he was deeply concerned about North Korea and the threat of a nuclear attack. He didn't see their missile tests as the actions of a madman, but as calculated experiments to improve their nuclear capabilities.
And the DOE was key in analyzing those tests, to assess how dangerous North Korea's program really was.
Absolutely. The scientists at the DOE's national labs, they have so much expertise in nuclear weapons technology. They were able to provide these vital insights into what North Korea could actually do and how we might be able to counter that threat.
But Lewis makes it clear that just having the experts isn't enough. Political leaders have to be willing to listen, to understand the complexities.
Exactly. And he uses the Iran nuclear deal as a case study. The Obama administration, working with all these international partners, negotiated this incredibly complex agreement to limit Iran's nuclear program in exchange for lifting sanctions. But the Trump administration, they were skeptical of the deal from the start, and they ended up withdrawing the U.S. from it.
Even though nuclear experts were saying that the deal was working.
Exactly.
Iran was complying with the term.
It was a classic case of political ideology overriding scientific evidence. A perfect example of the fifth risk in action. It showed the danger of dismissing expert advice and not understanding the nuances of a complex situation, especially when the stakes are so high.
It really makes you think, what can we do about all of this? As individuals, it feels like these risks are beyond our control.
That's a question that Lewis seems to grapple with. Throughout the book, I think he offers some answers, even if they're not always explicit. First, we have to be informed. We can't be passive observers. We have to understand what these government agencies are doing, what risks they're managing, and what could happen if we ignore those risks.
So it starts with education, paying attention.
Yeah, and it also means holding our elected officials accountable. We need to demand that they make decisions based on evidence, not just ideology, and that they appoint qualified people to these important positions.
So we need to be engaged citizens.
Exactly. Not just passive consumers of information. And finally, we need to support the institutions that are working to protect us, even when they're not perfect. That might mean advocating for more funding, for scientific research, for environmental protections, strong public health systems. It's about recognizing the value of these institutions and the people who work in them, even when their work isn't glamorous or in the headlines.
Right. It's about understanding that our well-being depends on these efforts to manage all the risks we face. This has been a really insightful discussion. I'm already looking at the world a little differently.
Me too. The fifth risk has been a wake-up call, a reminder of how much we take for granted and how important it is to stay informed and engaged.
Well said. Now, before we move on to our final segment, I want to remind our listeners that this is just a glimpse into the world that Michael Lewis reveals in The Fifth Risk.
He has a real talent for taking these complex topics and making them not just understandable, but really fascinating. The book is full of stories and insights that will make you question your assumptions, and you'll come away with a deeper understanding of how the world really works.
I completely agree. But we're not done yet. We have one final segment where we're going to share some of the most inspiring stories from the book. Stories of the individuals who are working to mitigate these risks and make a difference.
The unsung heroes.
Right. We'll be right back with more from our deep dive into The Fifth Risk. Welcome back to our deep dive into The Fifth Risk. In this final segment, we're going to shift our focus to those individuals working on the front lines, the ones grappling with these risks day in and day out.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the big picture, the policies, the politics, all the budget battles. But at the end of the day, it's the people on the ground who are making a difference, often without much recognition.
Absolutely. And Lewis gives us some really inspiring examples. We've already talked about Kim Klockow, the meteorologist chasing tornadoes in Oklahoma. But her story is so compelling, I think it's worth spending a little more time on it.
I agree. She had this unique perspective, working at NOAA, that big government agency, and then going back to Oklahoma to really focus on local forecasting. She saw how hard it was to create change within a big bureaucracy, but also that working at the national level had its limitations.
So she needed to be closer to the action, to work directly with those communities impacted by the storms.
Exactly. And remember that story about the tornado in Elk City, Oklahoma, where that improved forecasting potentially saved lives?
Yeah, that was a powerful example of how her work was making a real difference.
Right. That new tornado model that researchers were testing, it kept predicting a tornado in Elk City, even when they changed all the variables.
Just like they could see the future.
It really was. And because of that early warning, the local emergency manager was able to issue a tornado warning way sooner than usual, which gave people more time to find shelter.
And that emergency manager? Lonnie Risenhoover. He wasn't easily convinced by these new models, was he?
Not at all. He'd been doing that job for over 40 years, seen his share of storms, and he was always wary of the media. You know how they tend to hype things up, like a little snow flurry becomes the blizzard of the century?
Right. If it bleeds, it leads.
Exactly.
So he was skeptical.
But when he saw how consistent those predictions were from this new model, he knew he had to take it seriously.
And in this case, his willingness to trust the science might have saved lives.
It really might have.
It's a great reminder that it's not just about the technology. It's about the people using it and interpreting it. We need experts like Klockow developing these advanced models. But we also need people like Risenhoover, who are trusted in their communities, to communicate that information effectively.
Absolutely. It's all about building those relationships, that trust between scientists and the public. You can have all the data in the world, but if people don't understand it or trust where it's coming from, it's not going to do much good.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the fifth risk, what are the key takeaways here?
Well, I think Lewis is making a powerful argument that we can't afford to be complacent about the risks we face, whether it's nuclear weapons, climate change, or the potential for these catastrophic accidents. We have to be aware of these risks and understand what's being done to deal with them.
And we need to appreciate those people who are working so hard, often behind the scenes, to keep us safe.
They're the unsung heroes, the ones we often forget about, but who are so essential to our well-being.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. I know I've learned a lot, and I hope our listeners have too. If you're interested in what we've talked about today, I highly encourage you to read The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis. It's a powerful and timely book, a real call to action, to be more informed and engaged citizens.
I agree. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand those hidden forces shaping our world and what we can do to face them.
And if you want to explore these ideas further, don't forget to subscribe to Mindful Moments for more deep dives into the books and ideas that matter. You can find a link to buy The Fifth Risk in the show notes. Thanks for listening.